One dynasty's lie exposed, but the vault goes deeper. From the tombs of ancient Egypt, we now enter the dungeons of medieval Spain, where the Inquisition's own records condemned the bloodline of the monarchs it served. This is document number 7, the Spanish Inquisition bloodline proofs. The Holy Office of the Inquisition maintained the most meticulous records of any institution in early modern Europe. From its establishment in Spain in 1478 until its final abolition in 1834, the Inquisition documented every accusation, every interrogation, every confession extracted under torture, and every sentence pronounced in its tribunals. These records were created to serve the purposes of religious persecution, to identify and punish those who deviated from Catholic orthodoxy, and to track the bloodlines of conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but whose descendants remained under perpetual suspicion. What the Inquisitors did not anticipate was that their obsessive record-keeping would eventually expose a truth they had devoted centuries to concealing: that the Spanish monarchy itself, the institution that sponsored and protected the Inquisition, carried the very blood it condemned. The documents that proved this devastating irony survived in the archives of the Inquisition, transferred to state custody when the institution was abolished, and eventually opened to researchers in the 20th century. Among the millions of pages of testimony and judgment were files that the Inquisitors themselves had sealed, materials too sensitive to be processed through normal channels because they implicated individuals whose prosecution would have threatened the stability of the realm. These sealed files contained genealogical investigations of the Spanish royal family, investigations that revealed Jewish and Moorish ancestry in the bloodlines that claimed to rule by divine right and Catholic purity. The concept of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, was central to Spanish identity during the centuries of Inquisition power. Beginning in the 15th century, Spanish institutions increasingly required proof of old Christian ancestry for admission to universities, religious orders, military commands, and municipal offices. Applicants had to demonstrate that their family trees contained no Jewish or Muslim converts for multiple generations, a requirement that spawned an entire industry of genealogical investigation and, inevitably, genealogical fraud. Those who could not prove pure blood were excluded from respectable society, condemned to the margins regardless of their personal faith or accomplishments. The royal family was theoretically exempt from these requirements, their divine right to rule transcending the categories that applied to ordinary subjects. Yet the very existence of the purity statutes raised uncomfortable questions about the ancestry of the monarchs who enforced them. The Spanish kingdoms had been shaped by centuries of coexistence among Christians, Jews, and Muslims, a convivencia that produced cultural flowering, but also extensive intermarriage across religious boundaries. The noble families that eventually united to form the Spanish monarchy had participated fully in this intermarriage, taking wives and concubines from all three communities without the scruples that later generations would impose. The Inquisition's genealogical investigations, conducted with the same thoroughness applied to suspected heretics, had documented these royal ancestries in embarrassing detail. The files traced the bloodlines of the Trastamara dynasty, which ruled Castile from 1369 until the union with Aragon in 1479, identifying multiple instances of Jewish ancestry through maternal lines and illegitimate connections. They documented the ancestry of Ferdinand II of Aragon, the Catholic king whose marriage to Isabella of Castile created the unified Spanish monarchy, showing that his grandmother was descended from a prominent Jewish family that had converted only 2 generations before his birth. They traced Isabella's own lineage through similar pathways, identifying converso ancestors, whose Judaism was a matter of historical record rather than speculation. These findings were never published, never processed through the normal inquisitorial procedures that would have resulted in public condemnation and punishment. Instead, they were sealed by order of the Grand Inquisitor and stored in restricted sections of the archive accessible only to the most senior officials of the Holy Office. The inquisitors understood that their institution existed at the pleasure of the crown, and that exposing the crown's impure blood would destroy the foundation of their own authority. The documents became instruments of potential blackmail rather than actual prosecution, their existence known to a small circle of officials who used this knowledge to maintain their influence over successive monarchs. The survival of these sealed files through centuries of political upheaval was itself remarkable. The Inquisition's archives were targets during periods of anti-clerical violence, and many records were deliberately destroyed by officials seeking to protect the reputations of families whose ancestors had been prosecuted. Yet the royal files survived, perhaps because their very sensitivity ensured they were stored in the most secure locations, or perhaps because officials recognized their value as historical documents even while suppressing their contents. When the archives were finally opened to researchers in the late 19th and 20th centuries, the sealed files emerged as some of the most complete and best preserved materials in the entire collection. The first modern scholars to examine these files approached them with caution, aware that their contents might be explosive but uncertain how to interpret documents created by an institution whose methods and motivations were themselves suspect. The Inquisition had been known to fabricate evidence, to extract false confessions through torture, and to pursue vendettas against personal enemies under the guise of religious prosecution. The genealogical investigations might be equally unreliable, the product of malice or incompetence rather than genuine research. Early publications treated the royal files with skepticism, noting their existence but questioning whether their contents could be trusted. Subsequent research has largely vindicated the accuracy of the inquisitorial genealogies, at least with respect to their factual claims about ancestry. Cross-referencing with other archival sources, municipal records, notarial documents, church registers from the pre-Inquisition period, confirmed that the family connections documented in the sealed files were genuine. The inquisitors, whatever their other failings, had been meticulous genealogists, tracing bloodlines through multiple generations and multiple lines of descent with a precision that modern researchers have found difficult to fault. Their conclusions about which families had Jewish or Moorish ancestry were, by and large, accurate reflections of historical reality. The implications of this accuracy were profound. The monarchs who had sponsored the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, who had driven the remaining Muslims from Spain in the following decades, who had established the Inquisition as a permanent institution dedicated to enforcing religious uniformity. These same monarchs carried the blood of the peoples they persecuted. Ferdinand and Isabella, celebrated as the Catholic monarchs who completed the Reconquista and unified Spain under Christian rule, were themselves descended from the very communities they expelled and oppressed. The irony was not lost on later scholars, who noted that the intensity of Spanish persecution might have reflected psychological dynamics of self-hatred and projected guilt. The sealed files continued to accumulate through subsequent reigns, as new investigations documented the continuing presence of converso blood in the royal lineage. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled Spain from 1516 until 1700, brought its own genealogical complications, including connections to German families with Jewish ancestry and marriages to Portuguese royalty, whose own bloodlines were extensively documented in the Inquisition's files. The Bourbons, who succeeded the Habsburgs after the War of the Spanish Succession, carried French blood that the inquisitors traced through similar channels, identifying converso ancestors among the minor nobility from which Louis XIV family had originally emerged. Each generation of inquisitors added to the sealed files, documenting new marriages, new births, and new genealogical discoveries that extended the web of impure blood ever further into the royal family tree. By the 18th century, when Enlightenment ideas began to challenge the legitimacy of the Inquisition itself, the files constituted a comprehensive genealogy of the Spanish monarchy that contradicted everything the institution publicly claimed about blood purity. The inquisitors had become the custodians of a truth that would have destroyed both the monarchy they served and the institution they represented. The abolition of the Inquisition in 1834 should have been the occasion for revealing these documents to the world. The liberal governments that dismantled the Holy Office were ideologically committed to exposing the crimes of the old regime and discrediting the religious obscurantism that had kept Spain isolated from European progress. Yet the sealed files remained sealed, their contents known only to the archivists who cataloged the transferred records, and to the politicians who decided what to make public. The monarchy, though now constitutional rather than absolute, remained the symbol of Spanish national unity, and the revelation of its impure blood might have provided ammunition to Republican movements that threatened stability. The files remained inaccessible through the turbulent 19th century, through the restoration of conservative governments and the periodic revivals of clerical influence. They survived the Spanish Civil War of 1936-1939, when archives throughout the country were destroyed by both sides in the conflict. They survived the Franco dictatorship, which restored the monarchy in 1975 and had every reason to suppress materials damaging to the crown. Only in the democratic era that followed Franco's death did researchers begin to gain systematic access to the Inquisition's archives, including the sealed files that had been closed for centuries. The scholars who published the contents of these files in the 1980s and 1990s framed their findings in carefully academic language, avoiding sensationalism, while documenting the evidence with rigorous methodology. Their work confirmed what specialists had long suspected, that the Spanish monarchy's claims to pure Christian blood were historically false, that the purity statutes had been applied hypocritically from the very beginning, and that the Inquisition's own records provided the proof. The irony was complete. The institution created to enforce blood purity had documented the impurity of its own patrons, and the documents had survived to expose the fraud. The reaction in Spain was muted, in part because the revelations confirmed what many educated Spaniards already believed, and in part because the contemporary monarchy had long since abandoned claims to racial or religious purity. King Juan Carlos I, who oversaw Spain's transition to democracy, represented a thoroughly modern conception of constitutional monarchy that did not depend on medieval genealogical claims. The documentation of Jewish and Moorish ancestry in his family tree was historically interesting but politically irrelevant, a curiosity for scholars rather than a threat to the throne. Yet the implications of the sealed files extended beyond Spain itself. The Spanish Habsburgs had ruled over a global empire that included much of the Americas, the Philippines, and portions of Italy and the Netherlands. The purity statutes they enforced in Spain had been exported to these territories, creating hierarchies of blood that shaped colonial societies for centuries. The revelation that the monarchs who imposed these hierarchies were themselves of impure blood called into question the entire edifice of colonial racial ideology, exposing its foundations as fraudulent from the very beginning. In Latin America, where the legacy of colonial racial categories continues to shape social relations. The sealed files have provided ammunition for those who challenge the legitimacy of inherited hierarchies. If the Spanish kings who claimed pure blood were actually of mixed ancestry, then the racial classifications they imposed on colonial subjects were not merely unjust, but absurd, projections of anxieties that had no basis in the bloodlines of the rulers themselves. The documents have been cited in contemporary debates about race and identity throughout the Spanish-speaking world, their medieval contents acquiring new relevance in 21st century contexts. The Inquisition's files also illuminate broader questions about the relationship between persecution and identity. The intensity with which Spanish institutions enforced blood purity suggests an awareness, perhaps unconscious, that the boundaries they sought to maintain were artificial and porous. The very existence of the sealed files demonstrates that senior inquisitors knew the purity claims were false, that they prosecuted ordinary subjects for bloodline contaminations that they protected in the royal family. The persecution was not an honest, if misguided, attempt to maintain religious uniformity, but a cynical exercise of power in which the rules applied to everyone except those with the strength to exempt themselves. The psychological dimensions of this hypocrisy have attracted scholarly attention. Some historians have argued that the Spanish monarchy's particular virulence in persecuting conversos reflected anxiety about their own ancestry, an attempt to prove their purity by attacking others whose blood they secretly shared. The expulsion of the Jews in 1492, occurring just as Ferdinand and Isabella completed the conquest of Granada and commissioned Columbus's voyage of discovery, can be read as an act of collective denial, an effort to purge from Spain the very heritage that shaped its rulers. The sealed files suggest that this effort was not only cruel but futile, that the blood the monarchs sought to expel continued to flow in their own veins. Others have emphasized the political rather than psychological motivations for the persecution. The purity statutes served to exclude potential rivals from positions of power, creating barriers that could be selectively enforced against enemies while being quietly ignored for allies. The sealed files on royal ancestry were instruments in this system, weapons that could be deployed against a monarch who displeased the Inquisition or withheld in exchange for continued favor. The Holy Office maintained its influence for centuries partly through its control of genealogical information that could destroy reputations and careers if released. The destruction of the Inquisition did not end the influence of blood purity concepts in Spanish and Latin American society. The mentalities shaped by centuries of persecution persisted long after the institution itself was abolished, manifesting in ongoing discrimination against those perceived as racially or religiously other. The sealed files, by exposing the fraudulent foundations of these mentalities, provide a historical corrective to ideologies that continue to shape social relations. They demonstrate that the categories of pure and impure were never coherent, that the boundaries between communities were always permeable, and that the authorities who enforced these boundaries knew from the beginning that their claims were false. The Spanish Inquisition bloodline proofs thus stand as a monument to institutional hypocrisy and the persistence of inconvenient truths. The inquisitors who created these documents believed they were serving God and crown by documenting the impure ancestry that disqualified subjects from positions of trust. They did not anticipate that their meticulous research would eventually be used to expose the impurity of the crown itself, or that their sealed files would survive to contradict everything the institution publicly represented. The documents they created to enforce persecution became the evidence that condemned their own enterprise, a final irony in an institution that specialized in ironic reversals of fortune. The archives that contain these files remain open to researchers today, their contents no longer restricted by the sensitivities that kept them sealed for centuries. Scholars continue to mine them for insights into the society that produced them, tracing individual family histories and documenting the broader patterns of religious persecution that shaped the early modern world. The sealed files on royal ancestry occupy a special place in this research, providing uniquely authoritative evidence for claims that would otherwise rest on speculation and inference. The Inquisitors, for all their cruelty and bigotry, left behind a documentary legacy that enables us to understand their world and to recognize the frauds on which it was constructed.